Last week we were introduced to the book of Judges. This week it's episode 1 in the gory story. Okay? So it's Judges chapter 4, verses 24. And I can guarantee I don't get the names right. After Ehud died, the Israelites once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. So the Lord sold them into the hands of Jabin, the king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Haggayim, because he had 900 iron chariots and had cruelly oppressed the Israelites for 20 years. They cried to the Lord for help. Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapitoth, was leading Israel at that time. She held court under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the Israelites came to her to have their disputes decided. She sent for Barak, son of Abinoam from Kadesh in Naphtali, and said to him, "The Lord, the God of Israel, commands you, go. Take with you 10,000 men of Naphtali and Zebulun and lead the way to Mount Tabor. I will lure Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his troops to the Kishon River and give him into your hands." Barak said to her, If you go with me, I will go. But if you don't go with me, I won't go." "Very well," Deborah said. "I will go with you, but because of the way you're going about this, the honor will not be yours, for the Lord will hand Sisera over to a woman." So Deborah went with Barak to Kadesh, where he summoned Zebulun and Naphtali. 10,000 men followed him, and Deborah also went with him. Now Heber the Kenite had left the other Kenites and descendants of Hobab, Moses' brother-in-law, and pitched his tent by the great tree in Zanim, near Kadesh. When they told Sisera and Barak, son of Abinon, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera gathered together his 900 iron chariots and all the men with him from Harosheth Haggayim to the Kishon River. Then Deborah said to Barak, "Go. This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" So Barak went down to Mount Tabor, followed by 10,000 men. At Barak's advance, the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and army by the sword, and Sisera abandoned his chariot and fled on foot. But Barak pursued the chariots and army as far as Harosheth Haggayim. All the troops of Sisera fell by the sword. Not a man was left. Sisera, however, fled on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, because there were friendly relations between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the clan of Heber the Kenite. Jael went out to meet Sisera and said to him, "Come, my lord, come right in. Don't be afraid." So he entered her tent, and she put a covering over him. "I'm thirsty," he said. "Please give me some water." She opened a skin of milk, gave him a drink, and covered him up. "Stand in the doorway of the tent," he told her, "and if someone comes by and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." But Jael, Heber's wife, picked up a tent peg and a hammer and went quietly to him while he lay fast asleep, exhausted. She drove the peg through his temple into the ground, and he died. Barak came by in pursuit of Sisera, and Jael went out to meet him. "Come," she said, "I will show you the man you're looking for." So he went in with her, and there lay Sisera with a tent peg through his temple, dead. On that day, God subdued Jabin, the Canaanite king, before the Israelites, and the hand of the Israelites grew stronger and stronger against Jabin, the Canaanite king, until they destroyed him. This is the word of the Lord.
Oh, thank you, Ruth. I do like that passage. I used to go camping with my wife. Every time I hear that passage read, I think, oh, how lucky I was. Believe me, there were some times when we were camping when Elaine would quite merrily have put a tent peg through my head. Okay, let's do a quick check here. We've got anybody from Manchester? Oh, we got one. Okay. Obviously quite quiet in Manchester. Salford? Anybody in from Salford? Give us a shout. Oh, don't just put your hand up. Give us a shout. That's a bit better. Right, good. Bury. Anybody from Bury? No. Oh, there you go. Rochdale. Anyone from Rochdale? No. Okay. Oldham? Tameside? How about Trafford? No. Okay. Wigan? Hey, good. They get the idea in Wigan. That's grand. Good. How about Stockport? Hey, good. Stockport. Okay, in which case, Bolton. That's a bit better. And we're all, believe it or not, Greater Manchester. Now, when I first moved here, I'm a comer in case you hadn't worked that out, foreigner. But when I first moved here, all those parts of Greater Manchester very much saw themselves as themselves. And it took a tragedy, a terrible tragedy, to make Manchester realise that it was more than just Stockport and Salford and Oldham and so on. And actually that we were stronger together. And the thing that brought about that sense of being together as Greater Manchester was the Manchester Bee. You can see it up on the screen there, I hope. Elian's told me, incidentally, I can't go that way because apparently I put it in shadow, so I have to keep this side. So, when folks see that bee, they have a sense of belonging, a sense of, yeah, we're part of that. Whether they were born and bred, or whether, like me, they come in and infiltrated. But nevertheless, you have a sense of being a part. And of course, we have all the mayors of all the different boroughs. But then we have our mayor of Greater Manchester, good old Andy Burnham, whatever you might think of him. And that kind of gives us an identity. Now, you're probably sitting there at this moment thinking, this is meant to be a church talk. What on earth is he going on about? But what I want to do is to give you a sense of Israel in the time of the book of Judges. Because the Israelite clans, the Israelite tribes, were a bit like Stockport and Salford and Bury and Bolton and Rochdale and Oldham and Tameside and Trafford and Wigan and Manchester. They were united loosely by chiefs, judges, leaders. And they also had something that they looked to in common. Not the Manchester Bee, but their God, Yahweh. And so they had this sort of loose confederation, but they knew they were part of it. Now, we British have a real problem getting our heads round the book of Judges. The reason we have a real problem getting our heads around the book of Judges is because we are an incredibly blessed nation. Since 1066, if you had a British passport when you were born, not that you necessarily had a British passport in 1066, but you know what I mean. If you were British when you were born, you'd be British when you died. Unless for some reason you decided to go somewhere else. You see, up to 1066, there were all sorts of different shifting alliances, different shifting territories in this country. But after 1066, it all settled down. Round about 1700s, we had the Union of the Crowns, and then we became British. By the Victorian era, it was fixed. Now, that is not most people's experience in the world. Some years ago, I was working in partnership with some Christians who were in a country called Moldova. And the Christian guy I was working with, told me about his dad. His dad had lived in the capital of Moldova, Chisinau, all his life. He was born there, bred there, grew up there, got married there, had kids, and then eventually he died there. Never moved. So what nationality do you think he was? Well, I'll tell you, he was Russian, he was Turkish, he was Romanian, he was German, he was Moldovan. 5 different nationalities. And yet he never moved. People groups moving is actually common in the world. What we experience in the UK is the exception. Now, the Judges period was seeing significant people movements. If you look at the picture behind me on the screen, you'll see there's a yellow arrow. The civilizations in Greece and in Crete were collapsing. People were taking to boats and going to other parts of the Mediterranean. And sea peoples were arriving from Crete and Greece and landing on the coast where that yellow arrow is. Then people from Arabia, from the Gulf, Jordan and down south, the green arrow, they were being forced up. And they were coming up into that part of Israel. Then there were the people who were already living there. Now, they tended to get the name of the city they lived in. So if you happened to live in Jebus, you were a Jebusite. If you happened to live in Shechem, you were a Shechemite. And there's loads of these in the book of Judges. But there's also one group called the Perizzites. And nobody's quite sure who they are because it doesn't tell us anywhere. We've not discovered anything to know who they were. But folk think that probably the Perizzites was the name they gave to the country folk, the folk who didn't live in a city. Because everybody in a city had a name. So if you weren't in a city, you got a name as well. You know, yokel, Perizzite, maybe, who knows. And at the time, there were 2 world superpowers. One to the north, called the Hittites, and one to the south, called the Egyptians. We know about the Egyptians because they've been pretty resilient. They've lasted down through history. The Hittites, bless them, didn't. But the Hittites were right across modern-day Turkey, Armenia, Iran, Iraq, that sort of area of land there. They ruled all that area. But both those superpowers were struggling a bit. They had some internal issues. So they weren't at this time particularly interested in judges in Israel. So they left the Holy Land alone. Now, Judges and Joshua, 2 books in the Bible, you've got Joshua first and then Judges. But actually, they're not like there's Joshua and then there's Judges. They're actually like that. They overlap. Joshua wants to tell us this is how we got in there and sorted it. Judges, on the other hand, wants to tell us this is how you build a nation. Joshua's theme is we won. Judges' theme is we've actually made a nation from a rabble. Now, last week, Roger used 3 pictures to sort of introduce this book. And the first one really struck me. He talked about a footbridge, a suspension bridge, linking the Exodus through to the monarchy. And that really struck me because, as some of you will know, my wife and I recently came back from working in Nepal for the last 3 or 4 years. And in Nepal, there are large chunks of the country where you can only get to it by foot. There are no roads. And these suspension footbridges, you find them everywhere. And they terrify me. I am not very good with heights at the best of times. But actually, these footbridges, you step on them, they move from side to side, they bounce up and down. I remember once when I was much younger, one of my daughters, not the one who's here tonight, the other one, was on one of these play park things. And it had one of those very low-level, safe-type suspension bridges. And she was going along doing all the playing, and she got to this suspension bridge, and she got on it, and we thought, ooh, how's she going to cope with that? And there were some people coming the other way, and she stopped, and she looked at them. And they looked at her, and then they stepped onto the footbridge, and she looked at them again. And they took another step, and then a big smile came across her face. And she grabbed the ropes on either side and started jumping up and down with all her might to make it really shake and wobble. That was when I knew she took after her mother. Because going across that bridge terrified me. But I thought it was an excellent picture. Because actually, going from being the rabble of the Exodus, the escaped slaves and hangers-on, to being a nation under a king, that is also one scary journey. If you go off one way, it can be a car crash. If you go off the other way, disaster. Getting on the right path is the only way you're going to get from the rabble to the nation. So it's an excellent picture. So tonight we have one of these chiefs, Deborah. Now you might wonder why I said at the beginning it's a Greater Manchester story. Well, anybody who does Hebrew might be able to tell me. But just in case you've not brushed up on your Hebrew this evening, Deborah in Hebrew means bee, as in bzz, bee, the Manchester bee. And she was based in Ephraim. Now you can see on the screen, Ephraim is quite a bit down from the north. And that's where she operated. It was a good central place, really, to operate from. People could get to her reasonably easy. And she was the wife of Lapidoth. Well done, Ruth, for that one. Lapidoth means fire. So it doesn't probably mean she was married to a bloke called Lapidoth, particularly as it doesn't mention Lapidoth. What it probably means is she was a fiery wife. So she was married, but she had spirit. Now, the best person I could think of to sort of identify her with that might be known to an audience like ourselves would be that well-known ancient Briton, Boudica, or Boadicea sometimes people call her. A fiery woman. She knew what was right and she was jolly well going to let them know. The bee was a prophet. You know, all this nonsense about only men should do stuff in church, well, read Judges, bonkers. She was a prophet. She was doing God's work. She knew exactly what God was about. And she commanded respect, because she was able to summon a warrior from the north up in Naphtali and Zebulun, a bloke called Barak, and tell him to travel all the way down. Now, if you look at that map, you can't read the small writing, but basically the pink bits are the bits that the Israelites controlled, and the white bits are the bits that they didn't. So to get from Naphtali and Zebulun down to Ephraim was quite a journey, because you had to go round and avoid the white bits, or you had to risk getting caught going through the white bits by people who didn't really like you very much. Now, interestingly enough, Barak also means something in Hebrew. It means lightning. So one presumes there was something about Barak that had got him that name. And it might well have been a nickname rather than his actual name. But anyway, the bee summons Barak, tells him, get yourself down here, because I've got something to tell you. And Barak, obviously because the bee is held in high regard, travels all the way down from the north of Galilee, right down to Ephraim. And when he gets there, he meets the bee, and she tells him what she believes God has told her to pass on. Now, the bee, Deborah, seems to have an amazing ability to bring people together. Because all those tribes you can see listed there, 6 out of the 12 tribes of Israel, she was able to unite. She was able to get them all to work together. And you'll notice that 3 of them are above that sort of bit of white that sticks into the pink. And then 3 of them are below the white that sticks into the pink. And that white bit, if you looked carefully on the previous slide, is the trade route into Canaan. So it's really important. The second thing Roger shared with us last week was the idea of this cycle. That the sort of nation-building process is cyclical. That you get this, the people mess up, God leaves them to their own devices, they cry out to God, God raises up a chief who's able to save them, and then it goes round again. But each time they go around this cycle, they move a bit closer to becoming a nation. We've already had 2 judges in the book. The first one, Othniel, he was the younger brother of Caleb, who you read about a lot in the book of Joshua. And he'd saved them. And then, Roger mentioned good old Ehud. He was the practiced left-handed assassin who stuck a knife into the belly of the Moabite king, who was rather portly, and assassinated him. And now we come to the 3rd cycle. And we're told that Ehud is dead. Now, he was down in the south. He was dealing with the incursion of the Moabites. But even so, his influence has gone because he's gone. And we're told the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, it's interesting this, did evil. Because when you read the book of Judges, you will find that the evil that these folk did is highlighted as worshipping other gods and not really being too distinct from the people around. Doesn't sound very evil, does it? But you see, God understood that it is very rare for a society to just change. There is a process that has to go through. And that process happens little by little. It can best be described as the idea of if you put a lobster or a frog or, into cold water and gradually warm it up, they won't jump out. Whereas if you stick them in boiling water, they will try and jump out because they don't like the idea. But if you warm them up nice and slowly, you can get them up to boiling before they realise anything's wrong. If you look in Judges chapter 2, verse 12, it talks about them incorporating into their worship elements of the surrounding culture. And in Judges chapter 3, verse 6, it talks about how they lived in ways that were drawn from the surrounding culture. God calls his people to have what might be described as a Christian distinctiveness in our day and age. Back then, he just wanted them to be distinctive by obeying him. What's this got to say to us? Well, I wonder. A few weeks ago, I think it was a few weeks ago, Elaine and I decided we were going to re-watch an old film, Chariots of Fire. It was in the run-up to the Paris Olympics starting, and it's the story of the previous Paris Olympics back in the 1920s and 30s. And one of the characters in it is a guy called Eric Liddell, good Scotsman. He was part of the British Olympic team, and he believed strongly in his day that you honoured the Sunday, that you did not work on the Sunday. When he went to Paris to compete, he discovered his heat was on a Sunday. And despite all the pressure that was brought to bear on him, he said he could not run because he would be compromising the thing that made him who he was. And he ended up running in a different race, and he ended up winning gold. And as he lined up to run that race, one of the American athletes came up to him and gave him a little Bible quote, which said, "Those who honour me, I will honour." When I was a young man, there was an awful lot of furore about keeping Sunday special. It didn't work. Our nation today, Sunday is almost a normal working day like any other day. And that's fine for wider society. But for us, keeping Sunday special or having a Sabbath, having a day off one day in 7, God gave it to us to bless us because we work better, we live better when we have that break. But I wonder, how distinctive are we with something like that? Do we make a point of taking one day in 7 and saying this is going to be a day of rest and restoration, a day of family, a day of worship? I wonder. Now, Barak has arrived, and the bee tells him this prophecy about Israel's victory, to set them free from Canaanite oppression. Now, this Canaanite oppression has been going on for 20 years. What's significant about this is that this is the start of the Iron Age. So we have got the Israelites who have the old-fashioned weapons of bronze, and we've got the Canaanites, who we know from archaeology had iron weapons. And you can see some examples on the screen. What this means is it was a bit like at the start of the Second World War when Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and Nazi Germany had tanks, panzers, and lined up against them, the Polish army had horses. Horses against tanks, not going to work very well. In the same way, the Israelites with bronze weapons up against the Canaanites with iron weapons is not going to work very well. And that's part of the reason why for 20 years they had been oppressed by the Canaanites. But Deborah's saying, God is telling us if we cut this trade route, we can lift the oppression and we can also continue to grow in the land. The trade route is the key. So when the bee tells Barak how God is going to, if you like, sting the Canaanite forces, Barak replies, maybe this is where he got his nickname from, because he was very quick. He was like lightning, in fact, to say, well, if you go, I'll go, but if you ain't going, I'm not going either. Because it was stupid. Could I have the next slide up, please? He was, in effect, saying, you must be joking. Can I have the next slide up, please? Thank you. Good. Okay. It was a suicide mission to take the Israelite troops out to face these 900 iron-clad chariots. Of course, the bee puts her life where her mouth is and says, okay, I'll come. And I think that took the wind out of Barak's sails. But then she also says, because you've done this, you're not going to get the honour for this. It's going to go to a woman. Now, I bet at that point he's thinking, oh, she's going to take the credit. Or maybe he's thinking, well, what's this all about? But in practice, it was another prophecy. It was God saying, because you've done this, we're going to deal with Sisera in a different way. Now, you might wonder how on earth Barak actually managed to defeat the Canaanites, given the total imbalance. You have to read chapter 5 to find out. We're told that when they went out, the Lord marched from the land of Edom. The earth shook, the heavens poured, the clouds poured down water. The river Kishon swept them away. The age-old river, the river Kishon. You can see that there is a river that has to be crossed and there's a valley. It would appear that there was a massive thunderstorm, an enormous downpour, and the effect of that was to give the Israelites victory. Why? Because the one place you don't want heavy iron chariots is in boggy ground, because they just sink. And that's very probably why Sisera fled on foot, because his chariot got stuck in the mud. And if you think, well, that sounds a bit odd, I can tell you that going into D-Day in the Second World War, that long before the invasion of Normandy, they were actually testing all the Normandy beaches to check whether the sand would support tanks. Because the same would have happened to tanks had the beaches been soft. You can't maneuver. Not only that, but if you remember from an earlier slide, 3 of the tribes were to the north. 3 of the tribes were to the south. Barak went to Tabor very openly, so Sisera went to face him. Where did the other 3 tribes come from? They came from behind. And once he'd sunk into the mud, what could he do? It was a disaster. And so they fled. And he flees to Heber's wife's tent. Now, at this point, there's another Second World War analogy. During 1940 to 1944, France suffered 4 years of occupation. During that time, Nazis committed terrible atrocities. And about 3% of the French population joined the French resistance and tried to take them on. Heber is what we would call today a collaborator. He left the other Kenites and he'd gone over to the Canaanites. 20 years of oppression. Not just 4, but 20 years of oppression, of exploitation, of abuse. And there would have been an Israelite resistance, if you like. He made the mistake of going to the tent of one of those. In Lyon, during the Second World War, there was a guy called Klaus Barbie. He perpetrated incredible abuses on the French people. He was known as the Butcher of Lyon. At the end of the Second World War, he fled to Bolivia. And it wasn't until 1983 that he was finally caught and brought to justice. He had been sentenced to death in his absence in 1947 and again in 1954. But by the time 1983 came round, France no longer had a death penalty. So he instead was given life imprisonment. I am quite sure that had any of the French resistance encountered Klaus Barbie, they would have done exactly the same as Jael did to Sisera. She took her chance to seek justice. Desperate times require desperate measures when evil reigns. Doesn't make it right, but hopefully it helps us to understand. So God was in this story. God required enormous faith from people. But then God did an amazing thing. And afterwards, Deborah, the bee, declared how we can see God at work. Judges chapter 5 opens with, when the shepherds of God's people take the lead, when God's people willingly offer themselves, praise the Lord. Now, I could have picked loads of characters from history. I picked a guy called William Carey. He was a cobbler in the 1700s in Northampton. And he used to mend shoes, but while he mended shoes, he had up on his wall sort of notes of different countries in the world. Because in the 1700s, new nations were being discovered. And he used to mend shoes and pray for those places, even though he didn't know much about them. Because he was really, really keen that they might know God's care for them, that they might be set free from oppressors. Eventually, he also, like the bee, had to put his money where his mouth was, his life where his mouth was. He set up the first modern mission society, and he went off to India. And when he got to India, he proceeded to start to share the love of God with folk in India. He is attributed with the phrase, expect great things from God, attempt great things for God. The order of that is important. Expectation comes first. What does God want us to do must always come before attempting it. Otherwise, we can just end up burning ourselves out to no avail. But if we, like the bee, like Deborah, seeking God's direction and then going for it, we too can see God setting people free, can see him destroy unjust systems, and we can see him perform amazing feats to point people towards his reality. So this evening, I just want to leave you with the thought, what are you and I expecting from God? For if we have no expectation, we will not see him do great things. Thank you for listening.